Yotam's mother once was talking about how she saw it. She said, when the Messiah comes, the third temple will rise on the Temple Mount, and the top of it will be the Dome of the Rock. The hope, the hope was very clear that you don't want to displace anyone.
Yeah.
In my book on paradigm shift, I have a letter that I had written to Teddy Kollek, who was then the mayor of Jerusalem.
Right.
They were doing something like a special academy for people who are priests, Kohens,
Right.
to serve when they bring back blood sacrifices. So I wrote to him and said, well, if you have the Kohens, you have to have the Levites too. The Levites make music.
Right.
For that, you don't have to wait until the temple is built. So why don't we have every Thursday evening a rehearsal of what music they might play in the temple, which will be a house of prayer for all peoples,
Right.
and do it on the south side of the Temple Mount, and broadcast it all over the world. From Zion shall go forth, like the Tabernacle Choir, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. It never came about, but it still is a nice dream, of what kind of music. And I had Lenny Bernstein conduct to his 75th birthday the Chichester Psalms, and I had a Yeshiva rock medley and a gospel choir.
You don't happen to have this recorded, do you?
No, I have it in print. If you want, I'll copy the playbill for you.
Can you imagine listening to that, though?
Huh? Oh, it's wonderful.
It's been outrageous.
Yeah. And figuring, the variety of music that could come there, and I would want to see Muslim music,
right,
and Hindu music and all that stuff.
Right. Very cool.
I think that, if we were to get people to fuel that,
yeah,
the likelihood is that it would cool down a lot of the tempers.
Yeah.
Unless some Wahhabis are going to say this music is no good. Because it disturbs what they want to do at night in the Al-Az, in the mosque up there. Anyway,
they'll survive. What would you like to talk about? You want to finish the exterior and interior, or we have things we want to do?
I think I want these two guys to get a chance to know you a little bit.
Okay.
So Yotam and Barya are get their dibs, and we can turn those mics around. So.
He's just point one in this direction and one in that direction, roughly.
He's saying you can tighten his hard disk and ask questions that'll be addressed to him.
Anytime. And are y'all familiar with any of my work at all? Just so I know how much to explain. Well, sure. Fine. So now I have to do all the damn work. Okay. We'll finish by what we're saying about exteriors and interiors, which will give you an idea of what I'm trying to do, and then you can ask questions or we can discuss back and forth. One of the things that I've tried to do is take the world's great religious traditions, all of them basically, and put them on the table, see all the elements that they maintain, and then try to find things that are common among them. And it's not to reduce religions to a common core. I really don't think you can do that. But it is to find certain elements that they all touch on. And then you sort of do the same thing with the modern approaches of systems theory and so on, sort of have a look at all of that. And then based on that, you make a first rough pass at trying to come up with kind of a master template of human potential. So you basically look at what every culture has said men and women have in terms of their possible types of existence. States of consciousness, whether divine or secular, modes of existence, modes of awareness, and so on. It takes somebody really psychotically disturbed to even want to do that. and then to spend 30 years doing it takes somebody that really should be on major medication. But I persisted despite these handicaps. And the simplest way is we've come up with a generalized map that we sometimes call AQAL, which is AQAL, which is really short for all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, and all types. And this is just a very small swatch of the stuff that we're dealing with. But if you look at the great traditions all the way up to modern psychology, you find a couple of things in common. And you can approach this from all sorts of different angles, metaphysical or natural or anything in between. One is that they all recognize states of consciousness, like waking, dreaming, deep sleep, meditative states, peak experiences, and so on. They recognize stages of consciousness, and those are actually developmental unfoldings, and you usually find these in the great traditions in terms of stages of contemplative awareness, and all the way up to the modern developmental psychology with Piaget or Kohlberg or Loevinger, or any of these kinds of people, Claire Grace, spiral dynamics. They recognize types, and classical types are things like yin and yang, or masculine and feminine, or there are more complex typologies like Myers-Briggs, feeling, thinking, sensing, and so on. Or even an Enneagram is a 9 typology, 9 types that you can have. The quadrants are, in a certain sense, the most important to start with, because there's 4 of them. We talk about 3 or 4, but they're really variations on the good, the true, and the beautiful, and are art, morals, and science. And if you actually look at those carefully, they're very similar to first, second, and third person pronouns. And you find first, second, and third person pronouns embedded in all natural languages. All major languages have those. You probably have them because they reflect very real domains of existence that language has evolved and taken into account. So when you're talking about I, or self-expression, you're talking about aesthetic sensibility, beauty that's in the eye of the whole view. You're talking about first-person realities. And this is also art, self-expression, interior phenomenology and awareness, introspection, and so on. Second person is you. First person is the person speaking. Second person is the person spoken to. And that is generally you. But you also implies, if I'm talking to you or if I'm talking to you, it implies that there's a mutual understanding. So first person singular is I. First person plural is we. But we often include we with you, because if there's not a mutual understanding, then I don't know what you're saying. So second person, sometimes you/thou, meaning in the real I-thou relationship that Wilber would discuss, for example. So that's a whole dimension of inner subjectivity. It's one subject understanding another subject. And that's the good, or morals, or ethics, or justness. How do we appropriately act with each other on an intersubjective basis, not merely exterior behavior. And then third person is the person or thing being spoken about, and that can be he or him or her or them, but it's also it. It's an objective kind of over there thing. And that's objective science, or the truth in an objective sense. So you have the good, the true, and the beautiful, or art, morals, and science, first, second, and third person. It even shows up in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Buddha is this interior self or transcendental self. Sangha is the intersubjective we. And Dharma is the suchness or itness of everything that's arising moment to moment. So what we...
Hey, just a second. Are you keeping up?
I'm catching most of it.
Okay, are you keeping up? Okay, go on.
I'm one of the few white boys that keep up with the Jewish genius gene pool, so y'all can just jump in here now. so if you
When
take
you're through with the fourth one, then I want to ask you a question.
quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, what we do, the levels...
When you were talking about the 3 persons, and then the 4th quadrant.
Yes. What we do, just for kind of a symmetry, is we take, because... the it domain can be singular or plural, just as I can be singular or plural. So we talk about it, meaning a single it, and its plural, meaning systems of exteriors. So if you draw the 4 quadrants, you have an I, a we, an it, and an its. And those are really the individual and the collective, the interior and the exterior. So you have the inside of the individual is an I, the outside of an individual is an it. So in my own organism right now, I can look at it according to science and describe it in third-person it language. A brain, neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, all the kind of stuff that you're going to find in any scientific text. But if I look at my individuality from an I perspective. I have wants and desires and awareness, luminosity, interior desire. Those can't be reduced to third person it's. That's scientific reductionism. We really don't want to do that. But none of the quadrants can be reduced to the others, is what we really find out. So then in
now I'm going to say something. Okay. The nice thing about the 3 and 4 is like squaring the circle in a way.
Yeah.
Because Amos keeps on saying, for 3, yea, for 4, the Lord will not forgive. But notice this is a whole language.
It flushes it out.
Yeah, in which you have 3, and when you look at this phylacteries we wear, it has the letter shin. On one side, on the right side, a shin with 3 prongs. On the left side, a shin with 4 prongs.
Wow.
And so you
So
get
3 to 4.
3 to
Big 3 to the big 4.
The 4. The thing I wanted to say is when you were talking about the second person stuff, that's where I've been paying a lot of attention.
It's very important.
Because my sense is that whereas, it smells so good. Whereas we have been dealing a lot in religion with third person, talking about him, God, is he there, is he not there? Or first person, if you go to Shivoham, the bhakti lives in the second person, and over and against this. And when you talk about the eye, the various eyes, the eyes of the spirit, the eye of the body, and I kept on saying, where's the eye of the heart?
And that's intersubjective.
Right, and it's in that place
very much.
And I think that the new ethic that has all ethics that have been done, whether it's Spinoza's ethic or others, they were done as if they were exterior ethics.
Right.
And the ethic that is the interpersonal, that is and for which I keep saying we need a new verb, which I call the fuckif.
Yeah, I know. I got you quoted on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because unless we have this interactive verb, we will always objectify the process, and that would be the wrong way. So anyway, I just wanted to say...
Well, I think, I agree entirely with that. And what we're trying to do when we use Aquil is just that kind of thing. You want to touch bases with all the quadrants and say, am I including all these things? Because if I'm not, I'm leaving something out like that. So the quadrants is where we start, and that's I, we, it, and it's. And it's intentional, which is upper left, interior of the I, and lower left is cultural, is intersubjective culture of mutual understanding. And the lower right is interobjective, so it's a social system. It's the exteriors of social systems that you can actually see in the exterior world. And the upper right is behavioral. So it's, again, you can see the organism, you can see its behavior. All of the right-hand quadrants is something you can put your finger on. You can put your finger on a mountain, a river, on Gaia, on a solar system, on a galaxy, etc. But you can't see any of the interiors.
Anything that Krzyzewski says has a referent is what you can put your finger on.
The sensorimotor referent, exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. There are referents that exist in interior spaces. Savikalpa Samadhi, Saguna Brahman, an experience of interior God. That's a real reality whose referent is interior, not exterior. And that's one of the real problems. There are different validity claims in each of the quadrants. And
doesn't that demand an intersubjective agreement of two people who have experienced that?
Absolutely. Yes. If you actually look at semiotics and use the term referent, and then you look at Saussure's breakdown or Charles Peirce's, either one will work. You have a signifier, a signified, and the referent. The signifier is the material or spoken word. Let's use, in this case, God. So that's a signifier because you can see it, my dog can see it, it's a material word. Then the referent is whatever is really there, wherever it is, wherever that God is, and whatever shape for it. And the signified is what comes to your mind when you hear the word God. So if you haven't had a direct experience of God, you're not going to have the signified to match the signified. And that's why mutual understanding depends upon similar levels of development called adequatia. You have to be the same level of development to see the referent. So a dog, the square root of -1, and God exist in different world spaces. Those are different reference. And you have to have a developmental level of consciousness to see those. Does that make sense?
Ramakrishna is saying that some things you won't understand unless it's like two hemp smokers talking to each other.
That's right. That's right. Yes, they have the same signified comes up, and then they know what the referent is.
Yeah.
That to me is important because so much of the whole scientific materialist bent is to say if a referent doesn't exist in the sensori-motor world, then it's not real. But that excludes mutual understanding, love, and all of those things because they don't have a referent out there. They do have a referent in here. And in our mutual understanding of intersubjectivity, and that's what hermeneutics is about, and that's what all these interior disciplines are about. They're very important to stop the reductionism into mere Gaia, for example.
When they're talking about participatory epistemology,
Absolutely.
That's the kind of thing. But I see that Yotam marked something down. So
I was trying to write down the 4 quadrants because I was getting
Yeah,
a
it's a
little
go
long.
like this.
there's a book, I'll show you.
That's right, I'll do
The
my
whole chart.
Okay,
is
we
in
call the
book.
upper left is just put an I.
Yeah.
And then this is a we,
And then it and
it
it.
and its.
And then what were the other words you were using?
Intentional. So that's the actual intention of an I. And then this is cultural, lower left. Lower right is social, like social systems. And then upper right is behavioral. You can actually see the behavior. And so other terms are subjective, intersubjective, objective, and interobjective. And there are other pronouns you can use, but those are the 4 kind of most crucial because they cover so many of the bases. And if you look at Jürgen Habermas, for example, who's a lot of people consider the world's greatest living conventional philosopher, I do, he has 3 different validity claims. And they're exactly the big 3 that we've talked about of I, we, and it. There's a validity claim of truthfulness, which applies to the I, are you telling the truth? And then justness or appropriateness, which is the we or the intersubjective validity claim. And then truth or objective truth, which is the it validity claim. And that's really
with
important.
both it and its, or
It covers both of them. Now, I subdivide that in the way Habermas does it, and I maintain that the validity claim for social systems is something called functional fit, because the validity claim there is not just for an objective fact, but how they fit together in exterior space. That's what systems theory does. So that's a minor point, though, whether we use the big 3 or the big 4. We certainly agree on the other 3.
and then what's the validity claim for just it?
For what?
For it?
Just
No.
objective truth. It is raining outside. Is that true or false? And that's a reference. That's a standard so-called reflection map, or it's the Enlightenment paradigm, which is it's propositional truth or correspondence theory of truth. So is it raining outside or not? You go and look and you check. Now the interior claim, truthfulness, is if I tell you it's raining outside, am I lying or not? And that's a different validity claim. You have to, am I the kind of person
and
who would
that's a
lie to you?
subjective decision.
Exactly. It's also, you have to trust me to know whether I'm telling you the truth or not. And you can't tell that by checking exterior stuff. You can only tell by a history of knowing me, my integrity, my authenticity, particularly if I want
And
to
history of
find
the
out.
claim itself as well. Like
What's
if you say that it's raining here, then I'm much less likely to believe you than if you say that it's raining in Seattle.
Exactly. And that ultimately has an objective reference. But let's say you ask me, what do I think about that person? Or what do I really want out of life? Now, I could be lying to you. So when I tell you that, so truthfulness is a whole different, you navigate differently with truthfulness because it's integrity and trust and how you feel the other person and so on. And it gets really complicated because not only can I lie to you, I can lie to myself.
Right. So it's a question of whether I believe that you believe it or whether I just believe that it's actually true.
And whether I'm intentionally lying or sometimes lying to myself. And the whole study of psychoanalysis, for example, is the study of interior lies that people tell themselves. They're not being honest about themselves. And that's what psychoanalysis really started with, is it's a hermeneutic problem, not an exterior problem. And that's really interesting validity claim.
I'm speaking up for the spanakopita. It is.
He's a truthful man. I'll give him that. I believe he's done it.
And
All we've got is
let's-
finger food and there are napkins underneath the watermelon.
All right. Good. Underneath the
Yeah. You want one?
yes, and you pass some around. That's right, because when they get cold, they will not be as good as they're now.
Can I ask a couple other questions?
Yeah, sure, of course.
What do you do with the distinction between like the third person we and the second person we? As in me and him but not you, as opposed to me and you?
Yeah, that's where it gets really, really interesting. And that's where you have to draw this extraordinary boundary of mutual understanding. And so, because that really converts, the ultimate distinction is really between we and it. So if we talk about a third person, him or her, we either assume that we can understand them or not. Now, if we absolutely have no mutual understanding at all, if they're from Mars or speak a foreign language, it's an it. It's an object. We have no way to establish an intersubjective understanding. And actually tracing that boundary of the we becomes incredibly important because, just to jump to a big scenario, world peace depends on whether we get along or not. And that means we have to understand each other. And as you know, most ethnocentric stances are based on us versus them. And the them are its, and its can be treated as objects. I mean, don't have to tell you where that leads. It leads to Auschwitz and all sorts of other things. That's what happens when you treat people as an it and not a subject or an intersubject. So that's, if you then look at the developmental component that we were talking about, which is quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, or levels of development, you find that the we goes from very egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric spaces, pre-conventional to conventional to post-conventional. And so a lot of world peace, for example, depends on the growth of consciousness to these higher world-centric states and stages. And that's why developmental components become such an important part of the processes that we would be interested in. And why somebody can't just come in, you can't just teach people to love. They have to grow into these stages, actually. It's very interesting.
So one of the things, I once gave you a blurb for something about saying that you're the emerging Kabbalah.
You were very kind. You said the Kabbalah of the future will rest on Ken's work.
That's right. And I said this to the people at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College when they were talking about the modern period as ending with Kaplan, Heschel, and Boulder. And I was saying that your cosmology is old. And you will not be able to help people with this new emerging cosmology.
Yeah.
And it looks to me that by learning that grid, one is almost like, how could I format that part of the brain that hasn't yet been formatted yet?
Yeah.
That's where the quadrants seem to fit in.
Yeah.
And that makes it possible for the mind to be able to wrap itself around what the soul knows.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's a really good way to put it. It helps you articulate that which the soul already knows, and both of those are important. And it just goes through again, and it's like once you just think in terms of the quadrants, levels, lines, states, it's sort of, we also call it iOS, an interval operating system. Once you download iOS, it sort of goes through your computer and checks and makes sure you're hitting all of these areas. And it doesn't say what to think, or what, it doesn't say, first person, second, it doesn't say what you should think if you're using first person. It just says, don't leave these things out, because they're really important.
And don't make category errors.
Category errors and partialities and all this kind of stuff. And so that lets you kind of go back and say, okay, now I can take the insights of really anything, Kabbalah, for example, and I can start to see where its strengths are. And I can also see the areas that it doesn't touch. And that's okay. You can sort of fill that in with modern systems theory or cybernetics or any kind of stuff you want to. But you can really preserve the areas that are really worth preserving. And that becomes a very interesting endeavor at that point, because that's what I was saying earlier, that you can really fit, if you just look at the quadrants and you look at what the great traditions did, particularly the contemplative traditions, they really excelled in the upper left interior spectrum of consciousness. They just nailed it from subconscious to self-conscious to superconscious. They weren't good at intersubjectivity and knowing how cultures can mold your perceptions. They had no chance to know that, really. They weren't very good at system sciences, lower right. Now, they had an understanding of everything interpenetrating, but that wasn't in an exterior, inner-objective, scientific kind of fashion.
It was an intuitive move. They went that way intuitively. That's
correct, absolutely. And the same in the upper right. How could they know about dopamine, serotonin, and quarks and all that kind of stuff? So, but in the upper left, they're still bang on. And we've added a few things. Freud and Piaget taught us a few things about the upper left that Buddha didn't quite know a lot about. We can put all those things together, and by giving these other three quadrants to the disciplines that really specialize in, Then the disciplines themselves look at the upper left and they go, oops, we're leaving that out. And that's where, the great traditions can really go sliding in there with so much to teach and so much to offer. And my own experience, my own opinion, is that if you don't have this integral approach, we can actually come in and say, yes, we give this to science, we give this to physics, we give this to biology, we give this to evolutionary biology, we give this to systems theory, we give this to hermeneutics, etc. But there's this interior spectrum of consciousness that you people are not even touching. And that's the specialty here. You have a chance to get this into the modern and postmodern world if you do it that way. If you just come in crashing with, the truths of God and Buddhism and all of that, you just don't get very far. Except with people that are already kind of converted.
Barya, could you imagine a Haggadah written for the four sons? With the four quadrants, in the Passover Haggadah, there are four sons who ask all kinds of questions, and you have to answer them. And the whole point is to deal with all four of them. So this is just very beautiful. When I think how we could spend a Seder night for hours and hours and hours dealing with that, it would be a delight. Yeah. All right, another turn with those fun executives.
Get that, man.
No, you gotta have.
No, I'm fine right now.
Can I jump in with another question?
Of course, this is what we're here for.
So you were talking before about
I'll take that.
the I perspective as being something that you can't really objectify so much, right? And you're talking about desires and
Right.
perspective and things like that.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that a significant portion of what Freud and similar people were doing is trying to objectify that
Right.
and create some kind of a bridge between I and it.
Yeah, really, that's very good. That's great. Actually, you've hit on that's a really sophisticated point, and it's something I deal with in what we actually call the 8 native perspectives, or 8 indigenous perspectives on all occasions, and it's exactly what you're talking about. If you actually, to do this, you can sort of picture what we call a holon, which is a term Arthur Kessler coined, and it's just a whole that's a part of another whole. So an atom is a whole that's part of a molecule is a whole that's part of a cell, and so on.
And of course,
So-
consisting of other holons as well.
Yes, it's holons all the way down. And so if you think of the 4 quadrants and you just picture a circle in each of them as a holon, whatever the name is, an idea is a holon, an intersubjective or so. So there's an I, a we, an it, and an its, and you can look at each of those from the inside or the outside, just like you're talking about. So you actually get a first-person approach to I, which is just what I'm aware of right now. But you can look at I in an objective stance, and that gives you the exterior of an I. You still can't see it running around out there, but you can form an objective view of it. And when you do that, you get, and you actually study it objectively to some degree, you get what's called structuralism, which is actually where you get these stages of interior development. They're not how you experience the interior itself. There's nobody sitting here going, I'm experiencing a stage 3 thought, and I'm experiencing a stage 4 thought. But if you study people over a long time, and you ask them questions and you see what their responses are, you'll notice that their responses move through a sequence of stages, as if they had structures to them. And that's really what Piaget did, and that's what Kohlberg did, and that's what Lovinger did. And frankly, it's also what the great traditions did when they started looking at these interior stages and talking about them. So you get the I looked at from within is phenomenology, and looked at from without is structuralism. And you can do the same thing with an E, with a we. You can try to understand it from within, and that's hermeneutics. Or you can look at it from the outside and study it objectively in sort of a cultural anthropology. And you can do the same thing with an it, look at it from the inside to the outside, and you get autopoietic theory versus empiricism or positivism, and you get standard systems theory, which is looking at systems from the outside. But you can also try to imagine what the system is doing as a coherent whole from the inside, and that's what Niklas Luhmann did with Francisco Varela's concept of autopoiesis. So you actually have the interior of systems and the exterior. So you get these 8 different perspectives that you can approach these things on. And that's sort of the next degree of complexity after we look at the 4 quadrants. We actually look at the 8. There's an inside and outside of each of them. And that's exactly what you're exactly right. That was looking at the interior in kind of an objective way. It's kind of a hybrid.
So I'm not sure whether
You go first. Go ahead.
this point is going to be clever but meaningless or actually have any meaning.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that if you're looking at this from the grammatical standpoint, right,
Right.
with the various pronouns,
Right.
anytime that I'm actually using the word I in a sentence, to some extent I becomes third person.
To some extent, to yourself. Too.
Right. Like once I'm talking about myself,
Right.
I am that which is talked about,
That's
which
correct.
is third person.
That's correct.
And I suppose anytime I'm speaking to myself,
That's right.
I become second person, which again creates the kind of
That's right.
bridges and
That's
distinctions
right.
between.
And you're absolutely right. And that's where phenomenology gets really interesting. Because it really gets interesting if you push it towards the I. Because the I that's aware of the I, ultimately is spirit itself. That's the one claim the mystics make, is the ultimate subject is God. It's radical, absolute subjectivity. And once you push in that direction, the conversation starts getting really, really interesting. But what you do find in language, and we'll come back to that in a second, what you do find in languages is just what you're saying. There's the first person subjective and objective. And so there are actually words, I and me. And it's also possessive, I, me, and mine. And the same with him and her, she, and so on. There's a subjective and an objective branch, sort of recognizing that. And so if you actually look at what happens to I and me, there's sort of there's me, which is an obvious object, and there's the I aware of that. And then as you try to be aware of that I, at some point you reach this kind of infinite, almost backing up point. And you shade into that which can never be an object. And the great claim of most of the mystics, East and West, is that at some point you will get to this radical subject, this pure witness, that cannot itself be an object at all. But it's the seer or the witness in you that's aware of everything that's arising moment to moment, both inside and outside. It's aware of your body, it's aware of your mind, it's aware of your thoughts. Therefore, you are not your thoughts, you are not your body, because you're aware of them. That ultimate I is spirit, literally. And the more people rest in that vast emptiness or openness, then the more their identity is shed from this finite self into this infinite expanse of consciousness that can never be an object. And that's where it gets really interesting, because that's the pursuit of spiritual awareness on the subjective side, so to speak, the sort of radical transcendental self. Does that make a certain amount of sense?
A certain amount.
Yeah.
And it raises plenty more questions.
Well, what you were just saying is when Allport names that the proprium, he was trying to give a name to that.
Yes, yeah. And it's sliding, too.
Right?
Yeah.
And in the experience of it feels like the mind is going into a fibrillation state. When you get there to the point that it sort of knocks itself out
Yes.
of how would I say, discursive thinking.
Yeah.
All that stops, and that's very atzilic at that point. So it is a
Yeah.
it's a silent. What I wanted to ask you is, with the troubles we're having in the world, and I want to tell you a little bit of a shtickle dream that I had,
Okay.
and in relation to the sociable God,
Yeah.
and making transpersonal sociology work.
Yeah.
Okay? Goes something like this. Very often we try and say, what can you do with karma?
Yeah.
So the model that I have is, what's the word? Curling.
Oh, of course. The honorable sport of curling.
Right? And the captain sends it forth, and that's karma.
Right.
The sweepers are
Yeah.
the ones who can deflect it a little bit, but
Yeah.
they can't make it turn around.
True.
Okay. My sense is that we need some people who can work in the subtle realm to be the sweepers of karma, so that we don't have heavy collision. So the hope and the dream I have, and today is my Hebrew 79th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about what would it be if we were to be able to get people like Tom Keating,
Yeah.
Pir Valaya,
Yeah.
and such folks,
Yeah. and
we would get together 24 of such people,
Yeah.
and in some kind of a place where we could be like air controllers,
Yeah.
and spend
Start sweeping.
right,
Yeah.
and spend 4 hours a day, because
Yeah.
you can't do it longer than
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
in which we in concert 7 rishis
Yeah.
sit and do that work because the world needs it. Otherwise,
Yes.
the healing won't.
I could use a little of that myself.
Right? And getting into the subtle realm and learning how to do that, because when I look at the way in which the Rebbes did their work, we're working now on a book about the fourth turn of Hasidism. And there the question is, what did they do in the third turn that seemed to be able to change things for their adherents?
Yeah.
And sometimes he had a situation where a master would read that little quittel that was given to him and see the karma there and it wasn't good.
Yeah.
He would take his glasses off and wipe the glasses and do whatever he's doing on the inside.
Yeah.
And they never made that explicit. That's a pity.
Yeah.
But then after a while he would turn and say, and give a good answer.
Yeah.
Sometimes he would change the combination of things by adding another letter through another thing so that it would work out. And my sense is that every tradition has had people who were able to do these shamanic, subtle shifts to be able to bring about a better situation.
Yeah.
Hold this part of the macrame for a moment.
Yeah.
Now there is, we saw not too long ago, a videotape of someone who's doing body talk.
Doing what?
Body talk, he calls it. He goes and with muscle testing, he gets to the body to tell him things. And what he's trying to do with this is to get into the matrix that underlies the physical connections.
Right.
And if he can find where the knots are that are not, where the body is not happy, is not in its harmony, and he does something about that, and symptoms leave and disease leaves and so on and so on.
Right.
I was very, very impressed.
Right.
He was also talking about something that seemed to touch on dibuks in a way by saying that there are parasites that come in.
Yeah. I believe that.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and
I know several on this.
and how to get rid of them, So now I'm thinking of, if this is in the individual case, how much more so is this on the global situation? Imagine then for a moment that we would get somebody who would be a spiritual Ralpher.
Yeah.
And he could Ralph Muhammad in the Quran at this point.
That would help.
How, and so I'm saying,
social acupuncture kind of thing.
Yeah. If we could create a situation of that sort, I think that would be what the UN needs in order to also be able to function, to have something that would look at the UN and see where are those knots that don't allow themselves to be worked.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, I just wanted to say, so have you got any thoughts about transpersonal sociology in application, like engaged?
Doing like you're talking about? No, except it's desperately needed. And part of the difficulty is that in the world at large, if we actually look at sort of the sort of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern epochs, one of the great difficulties is that in the world today, the force that causes the most dissension among people is religion.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference between, if you actually look at the levels of development, we make a distinction between pre-rational and trans-rational states. In the pre-rational states, Gene Gebser most famously described them as archaic, magic, mythic, rational. And then there are trans-rational states, which would be contemplative or meditative. And these are truly super-conscious states, not infraconscious or pre-conscious or pre-rational. And because a lot of the great religions were born at the time when humanity was in its magic and mythic stages, even though those religions had their esoteric core, they were always contemplative or transrational, they mostly got identified with the myths, the actual dogmatic structures of belief. And those are ethnocentric. They just, when they first brought up, I mean, if you are Hindu, you do not believe that Jews are going to be saved. And so
you also needed a high degree of surface tension between the various groups, otherwise they couldn't have developed it.
Exactly. And also it was a step up from magic, because with tribal structures, you're only related and you can only have mutual understanding through blood lineage or kinship. When tribes run into other tribes that aren't kinship related, there's nothing in common. It's very, very difficult to forge communication. So classically, that's the magic structure. Classically, what happened during the great mythic period, which started around 10,000 BC, is tribes started to locate their origin not through biology, but through divinity. So the 12 tribes of Israel could have a common God that would unite otherwise separate blood lineages. And so mythology was a great move up. It united warring tribes under one cultural myth and understanding, which is fantastic. But that myth itself was ethnocentric, of necessity, just at that level. It was a step up at that level, but now it's a step down. Because it's world-centric beyond that, and religion pulls it down. What we have to do to get to what you're talking about, in my opinion, is the modern and postmodern world has to understand that the real core of spirituality is not pre-rational myth, but trans-rational contemplation, meditation, and awareness. At higher levels, not lower.
That's what
Then they'll listen to this kind of stuff. But as it is right now, they'll take that kind of stuff as magical crap. They'll throw it out.
Yeah, that's what the guys at the axial age got to know while they were still embedded in the myth.
I agree entirely. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely
So
right.
now I'm asking the next question that would go to, when you're talking about covenant,
Yeah.
that is very much how the we is being maintained.
Right.
And what we would find if we read how old covenants were made, that they called the gods of both sides to testify that this
very
covenant has to be held.
That's very good.
Mendenhall wrote this whole thing on a covenant,
Yeah.
in which he said that the model for the covenant that Israel had was the model of the Hittite Empire. There was Shupal and Yumash, the great Sharurabu, the greatest king, and all the other people paid tribute to him, and so on and so forth, were kings. So that he was the king of kings, and
Right.
there were the other kings.
Right.
And so when we speak of God, we say he's the king of
Right.
kings, you know,
Right.
which is a way of saying even beyond that. But that awareness of such power being located in one person
Yeah.
was amazing. Now we come and ask the question, how do we make covenants that hold?
Right.
And they're all based on utility and convenience. So
Yeah,
when we talk
yeah.
about why is it that our president is unable to see himself working in a global,
Right.
in a total way, only
Right.
has to do this narrow ethnic for the people who are his supporters.
He's very much mythic membership, ethnocentric level of development, and he believes in fundamentalist biblical values. And it's a monotonous readout from that level of development. That's what's alarmed everybody. Is it's really a step down, in a sense, and that tends to happen when a country gets threatened after 9/11. That whole spiral of development we notch down about a stage and a half.
As if to say that we're going into the reptilian brain.
Because we got scared, and that's what happens.
Yeah.
You go down to the reptilian brain center. You start looking after me and mine. You get there, and you regress from world-centric, which the Western democracies were operating from, down into this ethnocentric, unilateralist stance, which freaks the rest of the world out. We were sitting on the only superpower in the world,
Yeah.
and we're a mythic membership, ethnocentric dickhead running this thing. Europe is totally freaked out, and rightly so.
Then the question that everybody's worried about that we get on the web is there a way in which you can up-level this whole thing?
Yeah, get those guys sweeping.
Well,
Sweep.
that's why I feel that this would be, in the integral system that you're building right now. I don't know if I'm going to live that long.
Well, that's the other thing. Yeah.
But I would like to be able to see something of this sort. We were talking about jobs I never got,
Yeah.
that I applied for but I never got. But one time I wanted a job to be in the religious ministry of Israel. And I wanted to be the liaison person to the other religions. So I would come to the Armenian bishop or patriarch, before he has a celebration, bring him a basket of fruit, and we would honor him so that he would have a sense that he is really recognized as part of a person rather than depersonalized.
Right.
And I felt the same thing to be done with the Muslim people there and with the various Christians and so on. I never got that job.
Yeah.
But, I think it would
Nor
be...
did anybody else.
Nor did anyone else. That's right. But
Were you overqualified or underqualified?
They
No,
didn't
I
create
think-
the job.
Yeah, great.
I think the point is that the people who had to make the decision were not on that same level to be able to
understand.
think that way. But it looks to me that the infrastructure for allowing such a group of people to meet, I mean, that's what was his name? The one who did the thing at the UN, Swami at the UN.
Not Satchidananda.
No.
Which Swami at the UN?
It'll come to me. He's the one who brought people together and played all kinds of instruments and music and so on. Can't remember his name.
We'll write it down.
But I think what he wanted to do is of that sort. In Israel, we met a rabbi who is at the Knesset. He's in charge of the synagogue of the Knesset. And he was talking about...
That's quite a job.
Yeah, and he was talking about that in Israel what we need is keep the land together, but have two governments. So that the Palestinians have their government, the Israelis have their government.
Binational? Is that what you, yeah.
Not quite
Not
binational.
quite close?
Each one has their own nation, as it were. You know.
Oh, I see.
The mind, the usual mind can't apprehend how is it possible that you should have two governments that operate in concert with each other, but each one feels responsible to their own government, and that they share one land.
Sounds like Christ with one person, two natures, but that's okay. We'll get to that later.
Well, the hope was that this way, how would I say, it creates a possibility of polyandry, as it were.
Well, it could be a new covenant too, couldn't it?
That's right. And
They get both gods to agree on that one. That would be a
and
start.
most people say it's a nice idea, and we can't do anything. It's a nice idea. It's like somebody once said, two positives, can they make a negative? In Yiddish, yes. Yeah. So that's how people treat it. Anyway, I'm really always looking for a way in which one could make it a little bit.
It's hard, because the natural impulse, certainly for me, is that, you look at the situation and it's so dire that you want to come up with some, incredibly powerful grand scheme to fix it, because we don't have, we might not have more than a couple of years to fix it. So we can't just inch our way along on this thing. But usually change it's just inches along, And so at the very least, you have to think of the things that you want to do to sort of help nudge it along slowly. And then if there's a catastrophe, I don't think there's a case in history where people have put something into place before catastrophe. It's catastrophe hits, and then you clean up. And you hope you clean up a little wiser than
but that's where it's different. See, I go back to the early 80s. And when you got deep into meditation, or I got deep into meditation, I would hear a scream from the future that says, wake up, all this is holy stuff, but it's angel shit in comparison to what might happen to the planet if we have a nuclear blowout.
Yep.
So many people who were into spirituality would get that hit. A little later, in the 90s, we got the hit in relation to the environment.
Right.
Deep, you go inside, and then the scream comes from the environment, we are drowning, And I feel that the other thing came to me in terms of elder mind, that the planet needs elder mind. It needs people who are sort of past their hormonal drivenness of things and gotten to the place where they could contemplate about what's going on, and that's needed. So my question now is about if you try and do this by imposing a strong means, you're doing the same thing that Al-Qaeda is doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the subtle stuff that has to come in, we don't know yet how to, this is where Dwayne Elgin talks about, what does he call it? The trim tab effect.
Yeah.
You can't push the thing very hard right now. First of all, we don't have the energy and so on to do it.
Right.
Secondly, the turn has to be made almost like homeopathy.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering if whatever thinking there's been around that.
At that level, no. The individual can themselves, every time an individual consciousness taps into a world-centric or higher level, it has a cumulative effect on the planet. So that very simply, every time you do that, that's the effect it has. And it doesn't have to be, a group of rishis, although that's obviously going to help. But it's anytime an individual does it, I think to that extent that happens. And I think that's very important. But we're talking sort of now about things like world governance systems. And, we just had a world governance meeting at Integral Institute. We brought in Jim Garrison, the head of the State of the World Forum, and we brought in the head of the World E-Parliaments. And we had this entire weekend discussion of just what world governance would look like, trying to deal with these things. And it's a dismally depressing situation.
That's why I want to go to synergy. You see, when you're saying each individual can do that, and that's good. And for instance, we had the conversation that sometimes when there is what they call it, a convergence moment, they wanted all to tune into the same thing at the same time. Organically, that doesn't fit. I think if we were to say, whenever it's going to be 10 o'clock in your region, that's when you have to do it. Because as the Earth turns, it would make more sense from an organismic point of view to do it each in the same place, as if, when I'm thinking, for instance, that one of the things I'd like to do with the Congress is have the people line up in a circle according to the sign of the zodiac and make their seats in that round. Not as Republicans or Democrats, but these are the Aries people.
They'll go for that. That'll work.
But think.
Why did I think of that?
But think for a moment what this might be for the mindset there if we were to see the complementarity.
Be wonderful. We can't. It's so not going to happen.
I know, so that's what I'm saying. As you're saying, an individual puts out an idea.
You put out that idea. Here's the scary thing. If you actually look at the demographics on the planet, and you look at, they're very, very sophisticated scales of development. We're using the simple sort of archaic, magic, mythic, rational, transrational, integral, and spiritual. The percentage of the world's population at ethnocentric or lower is about 70%.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's very spooky stuff because that's where the center of gravity is. And so you very quickly come to the idea that if you're really going to have anything resembling world-centric or higher governance, it's going to have to be basically an elite, which is to say a non-democratic, non-majority leadership. Now we've all often had that.
Question that comes up when you say that 70%. I'm wondering how much of that has to do with isolation. And that it's not, like there are people that are I don't know, good English word, Dafka, they're saying like, we're ethnocentric and I've seen this world stuff and forget it. And I think that a great deal of the population may not be in that state of mind, but rather ethnocentric because that's all they know.
Yeah, that's possible. Here, the way it's measured, and see if this answers your question or not, the way these things are measured is whether a person can take first, second, third, or fourth person perspectives. And there are actual tests for that. A classic, simple one that marks the transition from egocentric to ethnocentric is you take a ball colored green on one side and red on the other. And you put a child, maybe the child's 5 years old, I'm the researcher, and I put the green side towards you and the red side towards me. And I say, what color are you looking at? If you're 5 years old, you say green. And then I'll turn it around so red is facing you and green is facing me. I'll say, what color are you looking at? You'll say red correctly. Now, if I say, what color am I looking at? You'll say red. You can't take the other person's view.
At what age does that change?
Huh?
Oh, at 7.
About 7 or so, it changes, and they'll immediately say what that is. Now, if you continue to ask them questions like, okay, there's a doll over here, what color is the doll looking at? And you see if they can track second or third person perspectives and so on. A simple test like that. And that's how they used to define it. And by those tests, 70% of the world's population is ethnocentric or lower. And so that's a little bit scary because it's only with the world-centric, post-conventional levels that any desire for a kind of world peace or understanding comes into existence. And so once you start looking at the developmental aspect of it, it's both much more clarifying and much more depressing. Because a lot of it, because up to that time you have the notion, well, if we just come in and teach people to be nice, or teach people to love, that everything will be okay. It's very hard to get people to grow through these things. It really takes years to do it, because you have to metabolize structure, and it's like, getting an acorn to grow into an oak. You can't yell at it, you can't jump. It's not going to do it in 5 minutes. It takes years. The average estimate, this is just there are ways to accelerate it. Incidentally, the one thing that's been demonstrated to accelerate development, wherever it's been tried, is meditation. It's the only thing demonstrated. It doesn't skip stages, but it speeds development through them, which is a very interesting point, because that's another way that spirituality can add something to the modern and postmodern dialogue that it can't if you're just talking about pie in the sky stuff.
Cultural hothousing still
Absolutely,
works.
cultural hothousing.
And
Extremely important.
But I want to tell you a funny one. You're talking about first person, second person, third person. I was teaching at the University of Manitoba, and there are a number of colleges. And each year, sometimes you get assigned a classroom. This one, so I had a classroom for psychology of religion at St. Paul's, which was the Jesuit school.
Right.
So one day I decided to run an experiment, and I talked about first person, second person, third person.
Yeah.
Did you really get it? Okay. Mark down on your paper first, second, and third person, and I'll ask you to look at something, and then when you close your eyes, you look at that thing that I'm going to point to, and you have to circle 1, 2, or 3. Okay? Okay, I asked them to open their eyes and to look at the crucifix
Yeah.
that was hanging there. Most Protestants turned 3.
Yeah.
Most Catholics turned 2, and most Jews turned 1.
Really?
That's me up there.
Wow. What a great test. That's fantastic.
But that shows
Absolutely.
how we relate in this
Absolutely.
1, 2, 3 thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back one. If, as you're describing it, 70% of people are in a different developmental stage, then you do begin to get a view of the Earth as an organism which must
Grow.
willy-nilly
Yeah.
evolve, involving everybody,
Yeah.
those who are unevolved, those who are
Yeah.
at the time. Now, what's interesting is that what often looks like the more highly evolved, or at least the more technologically evolved, are the ones who have managed to create the artifacts that in the hands of somebody in a lower stage of development can destroy everything.
Absolutely.
So if you can't vastly speed up everybody's development, you're telling us we can speed it up some. But there's only some. And in the meantime, we have all these artifacts that can
It's a nightmare.
finish the experiment in a minute.
It's a nightmare.
My question is, what must we do to work on the other end?
Yeah. On the technological end, or that's a great.
Well, on the
that's
technological
a
end, and
fantastic
on
point.
who are the people who
Yeah.
are controlling the technological
Absolutely.
end?
Absolutely.
And what do we
It's a-
do on that end, since this one simply has to take its time?
Yeah, and it's a scary thought. It's a great point, though. If you look at the most criticisms of modernity, which is when the rational level came into existence out of mythic, are not really criticizing modernity. It's modernity could produce technological artifacts of a particular level. That, let's say, a nuclear bomb, for example. But a moral development at that same level would never use it. However, there's still people that are,
Yeah.
exactly. So somebody at a lower stage of development can now use the artifacts, because they're material, they're in the exterior. You can just pick them up and, push the button, that they themselves could never produce. I mean, an archaic magic tribe can produce a bow and arrow. You can only do so much damage to the human beings or the biosphere with a bow and arrow. But the problem is you get these artifacts from higher levels that can be used by the tribal ethnocentric mentality, and you do get Auschwitz. You get a very efficient way of killing people, or you get plutonium bombs, you can blow up the whole bloody planet. And so there's this disjuncture between the level of, we call it levels and lines. Some lines are very highly developed, like technological, and the other can be very low developed, like moral development. When you get a low level of moral development using these high artifacts, that's what most of modernity's nightmares have been about. Now, it's not a pure modern thing causing the problem. It's pre-modern getting its hands on modern, and that's causing the problem. And so the point you raise is very good, because some people are saying, look, until we get the moral thing up, and by the way, we're really lagging in that race, then we might have to do something about the technological line. We might just have to cap it. And that's, you take somebody like Bill Joy, who's worried about nanotechnology,
Right.
white plague, all of that stuff. It's a viable discussion to say we're going to have to stop technology. We're going to have to take it away from people that are doing this and actually somehow regulate it or control it. That's the only solution he can come to. That's almost impossible to stop that stuff. But on the other hand, what's going on? And it does take extremely sophisticated government-backed laboratories to do most of the research that produces that kind of artifactual stuff. The Manhattan Project can't be done in a basement by a couple of terrorists. So governments can put a clamp on some of that, and it's a legitimate discussion question. I don't have any answers to that, but it's right on the money for a question to think about.
So let's go into the other.
Just you want to follow up? Let me just briefly. Can we do that?
Sure.
I can't imagine that clamping would actually work.
Yeah, that's a problem.
So the only thing I can imagine as an in anywhere has to do with working in who and what, on what level would it be attractive and possible to work with the level of people who really do have their hands on stuff.
Yeah.
And who are really developing things.
Yeah.
And what would be the good in for that?
Yeah. That's exactly the leading edge question. That's exactly where we are. And that's the first thing that a kind of a world governance structure would have to answer is that question.
Well, see, I don't think it actually works like that. I think you have to be sneakier.
Yeah. Go ahead. Tell.
By the time it's a world governance, there's already so much, it's already top heavy with structure and a masculine way of thinking.
Yeah.
And there needs to be somewhere before that the right people who are deployed to simply raise questions, start discussion groups, begin influence, begin drawing out people to begin thinking differently.
Yeah.
So that by the time there's a world governance structure, something is already in place.
In place to do it.
Mentally.
Would you see that happening? How would that kind of be communicated, do you reckon?
Well, this is a big question. I don't know.
Could it be like...
I don't know. I haven't worked with large groups of people like that. I work with small groups of people.
Yeah.
And Jean Houston is the one who's working with larger groups of people. You know what she's doing with her courses on social artistry now.
Yeah.
And it would be a very synergistic thing if you and she were to talk sometime, because she is reaching people who are doing things on a lot of levels that really seat it in the person. So then she's never just thinking. Yeah. She's always using the arts as well, and so on. And she's reaching people now from all over the world. Yeah. That's only one spot. There must be other people who are also doing this.
I think it's really important. And the other, there's a bit of to continue the depressing developmental side of the story, because it does bring into play, I think, more than ever before, the real necessity for leadership. Because if you continue with the demographics of the world's population, about 70% are ethnocentric or lower. And then you get to the rational or modern stage, and then you have postmodern and then integral and transpersonal. The percentage of the population that, I'll take this country, the percentage of people that are at the modern rational level, it varies, but it can be around 30 to 40%. The percentage of people at postmodern, which is the first stage beyond that, is about 20%. They're called cultural creatives. And then the percentage at integral, where truly integral levels begin, is less than 2% of the population. Now, that's disturbing for several reasons, because the integral stage, and there's several, all those higher stages are integral in a certain way, but it's the first stage that appreciates the value of all the previous ones. So it understands the role of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, whereas postmodern doesn't like modern, and it really doesn't like pre-modern. And modern doesn't like postmodern and things pre-modern. So integral likes all of them and understands they're all important, and everybody's still born at stage one, so you have to go through these stages. So you never get a culture that's just, kids aren't born postmodern, they have to go through all these stages of development. Now, 2% of the population at integral, and that tends to mean that you have to approach those people who have already developed to that capacity and want a way of looking at it like this that would make sense, because then you say do business with those folks. And incidentally, the meditation, where that comes in, controlled studies have shown, just as one quick example, that if you take college students, and that 2% of them are at integral stages of development, and they meditate consistently daily for 4 years, 2% goes to 38%. Which is staggering. Nothing else has been demonstrated to do that. It's a very powerful tool for transformation. Nothing else has been shown to do it. But you have to do it day in, you have to do it day out. You can't just learn a new paradigm. You actually have to grow consciousness, and meditation is a very, very powerful way to do that, because it helps you disidentify with these interior eyes to find these bigger eyes. And that's what introspection does. So the two things we do is at Integral Institutes, we try to find people that are already at integral levels of development and give them the tools to go out and do what they're doing.
Maharishi was trying to get something like this, to get 1% of people to meditate.
That the Maharishi effect. There's actually empirical evidence for that.
I want to say something about all the people who are still on those lower levels. When I think about there seems to be an interest in sending missionaries. The problem is that we send missionaries to take them into our ethnic.
Yeah, that's not. I'm totally. Yeah, that's not. Yeah,
we can
yeah.
send the missionaries to go into and go, let's say, into Islam and to open Islam, to go into Hinduism and open Hinduism.
That's just our ethnocentric beating up their ethnocentric. That's,
A beautiful example of this. I worked in Alaska for a while in the school system, and people who speak Eskimo languages can't put a consonant right after the letter L.
yeah.
So help will come out helip, wolf will come out wolf. And I heard a teacher from Oklahoma haranguing a group of second graders once saying, "Now children, the word is not helip, it's hep."
Oh no.
Which is exactly
no.
that.
Yes, exactly. Oh God.
But my
Yeah.
question is,
Yeah.
has anybody taken a look and seen of those people who are, the bulk of people who are both in science developing technology and in government giving orders and in the military, is there, are these people predominantly in one or another stage, or is it a real mix? Is it a representative mix?
Yeah. That's a good question, and it's very interesting because obviously the cognitive is very highly developed. But it surprised me, and this is just a very small sampling based on my own personal experience with it, the number of people that are fairly high moral levels of development. But it's like the institution itself isn't, you know, and it just won't let it go, because your primary goal, if you're working in the Defense Department, is ethnocentric defense. That's the definition of the Defense Department. It defends these boundaries. It doesn't. We're not here to defend England or Afghanistan. We're here to defend us. And so until we figure out how to hold that in a larger space, it seems to take whatever moral impulses these people have, and a lot of them are very, very moral, actually. And it's in service of that Leviathan.
The institutions of this country.
Any thoughts on that? Because that's kind of the hard part, isn't it? How do we get over?
When I ran into that in an institution, I quit and left. So I don't know how we do that. I mean, I was training psych techs at Sonoma State Hospital, and they discovered that if they would do 20 minutes of massage on these severely developmentally retarded young adults, they could cut down meds, they weren't violent, all kinds of things happened.
That's not allowed.
But the institution that hired me to teach them to do it, the institution itself, the system, wouldn't let it happen.
That's it.
And by the second year of wouldn't let it happen, I left. So I was young then too. So I haven't broken through that. I don't know how you get
I think a lot of people in government have
string
exactly your
that.
experience, and they do the same thing, they leave. And that's the
Well,
problem.
and doctors are leaving, and clergy people are leaving. And the mental image I have is, I don't know if guys go through this, girls go through this with hems of dresses. There's this one little thread that now and then hangs down. If you make the mistake of pulling it,
Gone.
the entire hem comes out.
Right.
And I think there's the equivalent,
Yeah.
but I don't know where it is. That if you twiddle this one little thing and it begins to unravel something to make it loose enough to make change, and I don't know where it is.
We summarize what we're saying by saying if development doesn't occur in all four quadrants, it just doesn't stick. Somebody comes in with a great idea, but if you can't social institutionalize it, it just is gone with the wind. And the same thing with mutual understanding. We can all have this wonderful understanding, but if we can't get the social institution, the exterior concrete, lower this institution, changed, all the other stuff doesn't stick. It's just all this air that we're talking about. So we really try to track all four quadrants. We try to find things that are going to nudge them all up, because unless you do it all together, it won't work. And it goes the other way as well. You can work on something like famine, food. Nothing seems more physical than Ethiopia's hungry, give it food. But Amartya Sen, the great Nobel Prize-winning economist, demonstrated that famine has never occurred historically in a democracy. It always occurs in non-democratic forms of government. Now, a democracy is a product of moral stage 5 development. That means if you don't have a percentage of the population at moral stage 5, you're going to have famine. Famine isn't a shortage of food, it's a shortage of consciousness.
What is
And
moral
it's
stage
deadly.
5?
Huh?
What is moral stage 5?
Oh, it's postmodern, world-centric stance. So you have to have at least a government structure. Then that's what the democracies are basically called. And incidentally, since meditation's the only thing that's been demonstrated to move people up the scale, it follows that the only thing you can do to help world famine is increase meditation. That drives liberals nuts because they want you to just be out there working the food lines. So if you don't have consciousness to hold it in place, you can dump all the food you want on the borders of Ethiopia and people are still going to starve. So unless all 4 quadrants are brought up, we're in trouble. Same with environmental problems. You can't just tell people to do this. There has to be a consciousness to hold it in place. But we're dealing with the other problem, which is that consciousness is higher than the social institutions, and it drags people down constantly. And they leave. They do just what you did. And that's the real problem, because all the good people they get ground up.
I have a whole bunch of things to say, and you've been trying to get into.
That's all right. You're first.
All right.
I'll have him a little later, God willing.
So first of all, what stage do you have to be at to recognize the different stages? You know, like if you're still in the very, you know, like self-centric,
Right.
How can you even recognize that there is a world-centric or beyond?
You can't. There are different, depending on the different sequences. I'll give you the most common because it's very, very interesting. There are different. Every sort of human capacity we're aware of, multiple intelligences like kinesthetic, mathematic intelligence, musical intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, cognitive, seems to have a developmental sequence. And Howard Gardner talked about multiple intelligences unfolding through levels of development. What he also found is that they all tend to go through the same general levels, which are really variations on egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric. One of the most famous is the values line. So if you ask somebody, you know, what do you value most, you'll get certain answers to that. And the person that studied that the most was Claire Graves. And he found roughly 8 stages that people go through. And on the great chain of being, it's sort of matter, body, mind, soul, spirit, that's about 2/3 of the way up. He didn't find a lot of the transrational stages because they're so rare. So the first 6 are basically variations on archaic, magic, mythic, rational, and postmodern. And then he found 2 higher stages which were integral. And those 2 higher stages are the ones that 2% of the population is at. Now, he called the first 6 first tier, and he called these 2 second tier. And because there's a huge leap that occurred from first tier to second tier, and 2 things he found in particular. One is that fear dropped off almost completely across all domains. There was just a dramatic reduction in fear. Probably the reason is that you're so disidentifying with these lower selves. You're almost letting go of body-mind entirely. You're getting closer and closer to the transcendental self that's not identified with any finite organism, not exclusively identified with it. Zen Buddhism says body-mind dropped. That's the definition of Satori. You're no longer on this side of your face looking at the world out there. You're one with everything that's arising. And so fear drops off because you realize that you're basically essentially one with everything that's arising. So you can't really be hurt fundamentally. So that ultimate I am-ness experience. And the second thing he found is that even though people won't state it in psychological terms, the definition of second tier is aware of and befriends all first tier stages. So that's a highly self-reflexive understanding of stages. Now, they're not going to know the names of them. They're not going to know, oh, this person's at, it's at one stage 2, 3, or 4. But you can tell a second stage person because they intuitively meet people where they find them. And they realize that each of these levels has something important to say, but they don't listen to them as final advice because they're all partial and narrow. So it is that. It's sort of a self-reflexive understanding increases, so the very notion of stages itself can't be grasped until the higher stages. And then different conceptions would put that point at a different place, but it's an important point.
But couldn't somebody who's ethnocentric still recognize lower stages?
Yes.
And do people at integral stages necessarily recognize that there are stages above them as well?
In third person, but not first person. They know the description, but they don't have an experience of it. Is that clear? They know the third person it description. Yes, I know the stages are up there, but I haven't experienced it myself. And also, cognitive line runs ahead of all the others for reasons that are complex. But you can have somebody that's highly cognitively developed in low moral development, Nazi doctors, but you can't have the reverse. You can't have somebody who's highly morally developed and cognitively dumb. It doesn't work. We just find that's the case. So you can be at a fairly, is that you know what I mean?
Yeah, I hear that. I'm wondering if that's so. I mean, I'm just thinking of all the Hasidic stories of Mendel the Schlepper, or some guy that happens to be like ignorant, uneducated, not particularly smart, but just a genuine saint.
Well, but remember, the cognitive really only means the things we were talking about. Can you take the role of other? Can you take first, second, and third person perspectives? That's what cognitive means. And if I can't take the role of other, I can't really love you, can I?
So it's more about mental flexibility than strength.
Yeah, it's not book learning or knowledge. You can be completely uneducated and have a very high cognitive development. But if I really can't take the view of other, then I might seem like I'm loving and caring and all of that, but that's not real love if I can't really see who you are. I don't love you as a person, I love you as an object or an extension of myself. And so everybody has a favorite grandmother down in the South, who's so loving and wonderful and bubbly, and she doesn't know anything, but you actually talk to her. And she thinks gays maybe are going to go to hell, and there's the Negro problem, and she's not sure about them. That love doesn't really extend outside the ethnocentric boundary when you actually get in there. That's another sort of issue we can talk about. The general idea. Huh?
Agape and charis. Or agape says, I love the people in my circle. Charis is willing to go beyond.
That's
and
good.
so
That's one way to look at it.
Find charis.
And then there's the reverse. I mean, I'm remembering my mother telling me that when she was a child, her mother was carrying her, they were in a bread line. And I remember my grandmother always warning me I should be very careful and scared of the Schwarzes, of blacks. But there she was with a black woman in front of her with a little girl who did not have a sweater on a cold October day. She told my mother, you know what, you've got another sweater at home. This girl probably doesn't have one or she'd be wearing it. Why don't we give her yours? I'll put you inside my sweater and we'll get yours. And just did it.
I understand.
So there's all this disjunction.
That can happen. That can happen.
And I'm sure that's true in both directions for so many people.
But we want to sort of stay on, we come back there, we want to stay on top of you. So, but it's a matter of, and so somebody in the third grade, somebody who's 8 or 9 years old, can memorize the list of levels of consciousness. And so they're vaguely going to know that there's something like that, but they're not going to have a first person or even a second person understanding of it. So that increases as development increases. And it's also at a certain stage historically that evolution becomes aware of itself, and then we actually have evolutionary worldviews that just weren't apparent earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I got it.
Okay.
Also, what are you said some of them with like what people value and things like that, but what are the other tests to determine what level people are at?
Right. If you have cognition is basically an answer to the question, what is? Describe what is. And Piaget was a real pioneer here because he would actually go in and ask infants and children questions and then ask them a second and a third question, a fourth question, and so on. And so he came up with these stages of cognitive development going from sensorimotor to pre-operational to concrete operational and formal operational. And those are, with each of these increasing stages of consciousness, you can actually see a more complex world. That's what's so interesting. Different worlds come into existence with different levels of consciousness. And that's a very Kantian notion that's held up, is that the structure of the subject brings forth phenomena. They're not just lying around out there. And so cognition is one. But if you say among the things that you're aware of, among what is, what do you call yourself? Tell me which of those things that you're aware of you call you or I or we, and then you get what Jane Levenger's series of ego or self-development stages. If you say of the things you're aware of, what should you do under these circumstances? You get a moral response. That's what I should do under these stages. You say of the things that you're aware of right now, what do you need? When you get Maslow's needs hierarchy. You say of the things you're aware of right now, what do you value the most? You get Claire Gray's. And each of those have a series of tests that go with them. And again, you don't want to pigeonhole people, and these are very kind of fluid concepts, but they've held up to empirical research or phenomenological research time and again in both this culture and usually other cultures. And so under those circumstances, that's the levels part. We talk about quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. That's what we're looking at in each of these independent lines. And so it becomes, you get what we call a psychograph, which is you can take a dozen or so capacities, mathematical, musical, interpersonal, values, needs, and you can be highly developed in some and not very well developed in others. So you get the cycle, you get the sort of graph of here's the strengths and here's the weaknesses. And usually people excel in one or two lines. They really have a chance to excel in it, but they're not going to be so good in some of the others. And that's fine. It's just sort of a way of tracking it.
Lately, I've been thinking a lot about like child development stuff and just how people learn to be who they are and learn social norms and whatever else. And what you were saying about children needing to go through the various levels kind of clicks with something that I've been thinking, and it seems to me that oftentimes, and particularly in American society these days, people try to force children into higher levels than they necessarily belong, and that can stunt their development. And similarly, when democracy is forced on a nation that isn't ready for it in terms of...
Absolutely. It's one of the real problems. It's the realistic, necessary, and depressing part of developmental studies. Because it's depressing because you can't force this, and this sort of, no, I thought we could just force the new paradigm on people and then we'll all be better. Oh, no. It's just so sad, but it doesn't work.
So it seems to me that part of the Summerhill idea of education, I'm sure you're familiar with that.
I'm sure it's a force this on the kids idea of education. Right? Mm-hmm. It's a higher level force on kids.
Well, the basic idea of it is to just let kids develop naturally and live, give them opportunities and choices and there's a word I'm looking for, but just make resources available to them, but not force them to use any.
A little bit closer to the natural truth of things. Right.
And there's plenty of debate over how successful that is when kids are sort of encouraged lightly but not pushed at all.
It's sort of between those two extremes, just to briefly comment, because what we find you need is not just letting kids do what they want, because then they kind of tend to rot in a certain sense. There has to be challenge, selective frustration and challenge, and introduced in incremental ways. It can't be too much or it's just overwhelming. You can't shove a higher level on a kid. That's what boomers try to do. They take their level of development, which is postmodern, and they have Playfair toys and all this stuff. There's no concept for children whatsoever. They try to shove that on the kids. That doesn't work. But just letting them grow willy-nilly doesn't either. So the developmentalists have always found that what really works is when kids are challenged just enough with roles they can't quite understand. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the effective thing to help growth.
So then it seems to me that ideas like that, as well as meditation, can help people go into higher levels.
Yes, absolutely.
And that if we could find the analogs for adults to the kind of games that are just challenging enough that they make kids reach into the higher levels,
you're right on the money.
Then we could help people develop faster than just encouraging them to meditate.
Exactly. And the important thing about what you're saying is, remember, it's not a content we're teaching them. We're not teaching them a new paradigm. That's a content. It really doesn't matter what that is. It matters what level of development you're at. So you can come in with just that, the analog that challenges adults to think beyond what they're doing. And I'll combine that with meditation. And you've got the only two things we're aware of that have been clinically demonstrated to move people up the scale.
And then, since people aren't necessarily aware in anything but a very abstract third-person level of higher levels,
right,
it seems to me that getting them to meditate could be very difficult because you're trying to offer them something that they don't necessarily believe exists.
Yes, if you're trying to give them reasons to meditate, that won't work. They have to come up with their own reasons. And people have different reasons that they will. Usually they're suffering a lot, on the one hand. Mm-hmm. Or secondarily, there's this interior eros that they're aware of, this pull to something bigger and deeper, and they're not satisfied without acting on it. And either of those two can help people meditate. Just telling them their levels up there won't get people meditating.
So there's a need to have that interior eros that isn't sort of having a toe in the next level already.
There's a magnet in there and we don't quite understand that. It seems to come with a soul. Maybe it's reincarnation. Maybe it's just part of your longer journey. Mm-hmm. Some people come with a hunger and a capacity to reach these higher stations. Some people just don't. We don't know quite what to do about it.
There is one point here, though, that when you are in the society of people who have reached a certain vibratory level, that will turn on the vibratory level in other people. And so if they are exposed to people who have meditated and they feel that there is that Ananda part,
Yeah.
that which is the peaceful part that comes from there, I think they get turned on to it.
There's a simple rule about that, and that's when you take any culture, the lower left, whatever its average level of development is, acts as a center of gravity, acts as a magnet. And if you're below that, it will pull you up, and if you're above it, it will pull you down. So what you want to be is make sure that the culture you're in is just have a step ahead of you if you want to get up at all. If not, you're going to have this experience. It's going to pull your ass down. So Sangha, Buddha Dharma Sangha, is the community of those aspiring to nudge their center of gravity up a little bit higher. And then when you sit together under those circumstances, everybody is raised up a little bit.
Shabbos, Yom Tov, all that.
But you're right on the money about this stuff. You are absolutely right on the money about transformation, social transformation. I'm astonished that, I mean, I've been talking with colleagues for 20 years and they don't come up with this.
The stuff you just said has sent me off on another branch that I'm going to need to think about for a second. But what you were saying before about the technology and the people in control of it, seems to me that for the last 200, 300, 400 years, since people have started to get into the post-ethnocentric levels, there have been people who invented weapons thinking that this would make war so terrible that nobody would do it anymore, right? And most of them were wrong, and people have simply made war worse. And the people who developed the weapons were on a high moral level and a high intellectual level, and they were passed on to people who just had the high intellectual level to be able to use them. But it seems to me that to some extent the exception is nuclear bombs, and that in the almost 60 years since they were invented, they've only been used twice, or on one occasion, and no other weapon built with that purpose has nearly so much success. And like Russia and or the USSR and the US didn't fight because there were nuclear weapons there, and it's possible that having reached some kind of a level at which war has in fact become too terrible to be waged, there's no longer a need to cap technology, because biological weapons have existed for a while without being used, and chemical weapons have existed and been used very rarely, not really since World War I, and it could be that there is a point then, and we might have reached that point at which we're basically safe technologically, and people are developing more and more things, but we aren't using what we've already developed, which is giving everybody else a chance to develop morally to the point at which we don't even have to worry about it anymore.
I think there's a couple strands of truth of what you're saying, and then a few things that need to be disentangled a little bit from it. Nuclear weapons I think that part's exactly right. It brought humanity, that's to say human males. There are only 3 species that kill their own. It's rats, weasels, and human males. I mean, they're the only in the whole natural kingdom that actually kills their own species. But human males, it's sort of a natural reflex, and it's fine. It's sort of how evolution proceeds up to a certain level. By the time you make nuclear weapons, it's the first weapon that will literally kill all the lower levels that use it. And even some of the egocentric and ethnocentric levels understand that. And so in those circumstances, it checked that impulsive, murderous aggression in a way that was actually fairly effective, at least as in the way you outlined it. And I think that's very true. That there are some problems, though. It's not we're not out of the woods yet, so to speak, because there are certain levels and types of development that don't care. If they can get their hands on it, if they're suicidal and they want to take everybody with them, they will. And so we have to be careful of that. And then there's this whole, the unfortunate is right now the biological weapons, nanotechnology look to be a really happy ethnocentric weapon, because you can really wipe out a lot of people, but it's self-contained, it goes away, and you're not gonna soil your own backyard, if you will, if you use a hydrogen bomb. So terrorists they don't unleash mutual assured destruction with a hydrogen bomb, but a little bit of sarin gas in a subway system is kind of perfect. And so unfortunately, I think we're going to go through a stage where ethnocentric tribal consciousness can use these things to really ugly means. And that's going to be a problem for us, I think. If it was a white plague that once it gets unleashed eats everybody's liver on the planet, then it would have the same effect as a nuclear bomb. It would slow most people down. Now, so the occasional nutcase that would use it. But they're not there yet. They really look like the perfect ethnocentric way to cause real mess, actually, is what they look like.
That's what the weapons industry is doing now. Is how can we destroy everybody except us?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's no longer how much can we destroy.
Yeah.
And the weapons that will destroy people but not buildings.
Yeah, the neutron bomb. Yeah, no, kills biological things, leaves buildings standing. It's the ultimate ethnocentric weapon.
So now my mind has completely lost its grip on what you were saying that I said I need to think about. So if you would remind me.
Well, we've gotten to a point where weapons had.
But before I brought up the weapon stuff,
You were talking about how to raise everybody's level.
And it's going to let other people develop.
Okay. So then there are the groups that. Right. Okay. So here's what I was thinking about. And if anybody else wants to take the reins of this conversation from me, you're really welcome to.
After you're through, I want to say something.
Okay. So you're talking about how there's the center of mass for a culture, right? And that people get dragged up to it or dragged down to it. So I'm wondering, like, if you gather enough people who are in a higher level into their own subculture within a culture, then can they be more effective in raising the...
Both for themselves and those around them. And when they do it themselves, it's called a lineage tradition. And and that's really where the great spiritual traditions have lived. And if you look at the lineages, they're really astonishing. I mean, one of the really good runs in the West was Parmenides to Socrates to Plato. And that started a Neoplatonic tradition that ran unbroken to Plotinus. I mean, and it's just that. It's that first person to first person transmission. And that's very, very rare and very precious. And it's what almost all the great lineages are when you look at them. They're really amazing. And every now and then you see these runs. Even in something like a philosophical tradition, you go from Kant to Fichte to Schelling to Hegel. I mean, it's really astonishing to get these things going. And they're first-person to first-person transmissions. You're not just learning a third person, you're awakening the same state or level of consciousness. And then, so that's how these great traditions get started. And then it has its effect, the Maharishi effect, on the culture at large, which it helps nudge it up a bit. That's sort of the general theory. And I think both of those are true. And I think that's the really great, that's the really profound good that this interior truths have on cultures at large. And I think it's a large part of how evolution moves forward to higher stages.
So I want to say to Barya that in Chagiga, when they're talking about the Arbash and Yichnos the Pardes, and they're talking about how do you transmit certain secrets, and they're doing this one-on-one, and this is not to be done in public. And like that story about how did God create light, and this man says, "You wrapped himself in a talus, and light came forth." And the other guy says, "Why do you whisper? It's already written like this in the Torah, And he says, "But I got in a whisper, so I give it to you in a whisper." And you get that sense of when you get it in a whisper, how it passes in a whisper. That's the lineage.
You know, the Kagyu tradition is called the whispering lineage. They live and they whisper in your ear. That's something to be very careful.
So now I want to go back to the other issue here. The institutions we have today, and especially our government, started out by some wonderful people who were Masons and who were elite, therefore 32-degree Masons, and so they were the 2% at that time.
I believe that's probably true. Yeah.
Right. So they created, on the cosmology that they understood, they created institutions based on that cosmology. Yeah. Another cosmology has emerged. And at the same time, there's so much investment to keep the institutions that are based on the old cosmology that are now obsolete. Okay. Now, in the meantime, so if you say, how are we going to change this? This runs into the problem, how am we going to change the tires while the car is moving? Right?
Quickly.
So now I have to go and do something else. And I look at the NGOs that are operating. Yeah. And here the issue is going to be, how do we overcome, because even NGOs have turf issues. Yeah. when I look at all the peace organizations that don't have peace among themselves, all the ecological organizations that don't share one ecology. So the question of if we are going to make, I know that the tire that's changed is going to come from the NGOs, and it's not going to come from the...
Very likely.
So the question is going to be, what can we do to network them? And now here is where I'm looking at the beauty of the internet. People would complain, look, take a look, this is, the internet is running so much pornography. So I say, what is the information highway in the body? It's the spine. And so right now, much of the spine is in the second chakra, you know. So if there is this information highway, is in the second chakra. Yeah. But there is also the fourth chakra, and we have found already that when there were difficulties and so on, people began to share and help each other because it's the heart chakra. And I think that the internet is going to help in some way because it is a web without a weaver, and it is the NGOs, if you will, are behind the internet. And yes, we have cancers on that internet too, the neo-Nazis and what have you, and the way in which it's being used to send information, just like through the body. Viruses are passing on bad stuff to each other. But I do have, that's my, if I were to go to the place where there is a little bit of optimism still around, it's in this area. And I do believe that if we could get some people of each of the traditions and lineages to look at the people who are below and who are in the first tier, and to start helping them in some way by shifting the way the liturgies and celebrations. You see, here's where I come back into it from my religious technology, that I think that we would be able to do something of that sort. That's for leadership. That's leadership. It's people that are at second or third tier, whatever we want to say about it, start to share this kind of common understanding, and through leadership and example, they can, in a sense, lead first tier. That's what's supposed to happen, because we're always going to have a vast majority of people at so-called lower levels. They're more fundamental. Everybody starts at level one and works their way through, and people will always be stopping at different stations of life. So what we've done, though, is make sure that governance structures come from these higher world-centric levels. That's what makes representative world-centric democracies, as opposed to warlords, empires, or so now America has regressed to empire. We're now an imperium. We're viewed that way by the rest of the world, as an ethnocentric empire, and that's just scary. But that's not what's supposed to happen. You were supposed to notch up on these governance structures. So that's leadership, and that's representative. So the last time when you were interviewed by what is Enlightenment? Enlightenment. I wrote them a letter, and I don't know whether they ever published it, and I talked to Amy, I think. Well, you wrote me about your complaint. I wrote you about the complaint. Then I talked to them, and I said, you don't forget the translation people. Right. Oh, absolutely. You are talking about the transformation stuff in Tier 1, you know, and Tier 2, but we've got to go down to the people who are in the translation. Now, is it possible to translate? And I'm going to give you a copy of my latest translation of the Psalms, which come from that place. That absolutely. See, I think here's what I think has to be done. And as you know, what happened in the great Maimonides to the early church fathers, they were faced with a series of ethnocentric myths. And yet they're coming from these world-centric and higher levels. And they all came up with an allegorical and analogical method. And they say you can read a myth at several different levels. And that's really a way for them to be able to translate in higher ways what the myth itself actually contains. And so what you want to try to do, in my opinion, is you take the highest level of awareness or consciousness that a saint or sage has, and let's just say it's a third tier consciousness. And then that person can translate that truth for somebody at an archaic, magic, mythic, rational, integral stage. You actually use the terms at those stages. don't forget what we're working on right now.
Right.
Yeah,
It's sort of a catechism, in the same way. It's not very dissimilar from, let's say, if you want to explain spirituality in general to first graders, you have a course for first graders, and that's not a put down. It's where everybody starts. And then you have spirituality that you teach sixth graders, and then you have spirituality that college students learn, and so on. And it's not. It's in a sense the same spirituality because you're taking the highest understanding that you're aware of and crafting it for these lower stages. That's different from what a first grader would do if left to their own devices. Mm-hmm. So it's not first grade spirituality you're giving them. It's postgraduate spirituality that you have adapted for a first grade mentality. It's entirely different.
yeah.
That's what you should do, though.
That's what takes a kind of, just the same way as people talk in psychology about regression in the service of the
Absolutely.
ego. We have to have regression in the service of the spirit.
And each of those levels can be an expression of this higher truth geared toward exactly those. Because you're still going to have the vast majority of people at the fundamental stages, and that's fine as long as your leaders are up here and know what they're doing and are in fact in charge. And that's what's so scary about regression at the world level, which is what America's doing a little bit of. That's very scary kind of stuff.
You'll have to give me a copy of this.
Sure.
Okay. I could have set up mine too, but I got too excited seeing it. I want to say a blessing.
Oh, great.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar בנביאים טובים ורצה בדבריהם הנאמרים באמת. Blessed is the one who has chosen true prophets who teach us good things and speak from truth. Okay, and we say that every Shabbos when we are about to read from the prophets. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Barya, you can say the bracha I told you.
I already did.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. When I met you first, I remember we were down there and I was holding your hand and was saying that blessing because it's so wonderful that we have a tradition that recognizes that you want to thank that one that has put into this wonderful skull and heart such ideas. And
Thank you. That's wonderful.
You gave me a good birthday present. And I'm delighted for Yotam and for Barya, and for that. And you know what's going to happen? I think the books that I have, if they're going to get read now.
Well, listen, we have to start winding this down ourselves, but we can do this again now. I mean, you're all welcome, and if you want to think about this for a bit, and in a month or so. When are you taking off?
September 20th, I have to be there, and we're going to drive out earlier.
Okay, well, if you want to do this again before then, just let us know, and we'll set something up, okay?
Hey, wonderful.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Can I ask one more question?
Of course.
If the answer is too big, then you can tell me.
No, we've got about 10 minutes. We've got to skedaddle. Go right ahead.
So, when I'm thinking about what you mean by egocentric and ethnocentric and various other levels, it seems to me that the group around which you're centering your universe doesn't necessarily need to be an ethnicity in the classic sense, right?
Right.
It can be any. So, other than the fact that there's more people in it, how is an ethnocentric group categorically different from an egocentric group?
An egocentric group simply cannot take the role of another group. It cannot imagine what another interior is like. And so it's in the analogy in a single individual is an egocentric somebody who can only take first person. They really can't yet take the role of other. That's classically, prior to age 5, for example. An ethnocentric group understands that there are other groups can actually take the role of that, but they vehemently disagree with it. And so they're still going to, in some ways, it's actually more dangerous. Because if you look historically at problems that ethnocentric groups cause, they're just so kind of crude. It's sort of, I knock you over, I take your food, I rape your women, I move on. They're just not very calculated. It's when you get to ethnocentric, it's, in a sense, it's so much more complex that you really can sit around and think of cold-blooded, calculated ways to exterminate people. They really get scary at that point. And world-centric, it starts to dissolve because all of a sudden now you're taking a third-person perspective in addition to first and second, and that means that you start to see all sides of something, and so you judge people regardless of race, color, skin, ethnicity, and so on.
So, to use a kind of crude analogy, then, if you have that ball, and I'm looking at the green side and you're looking at the red side, if I'm egocentric, I think you're looking at the green side.
That's correct.
And if I'm ethnocentric, I recognize that you're looking at the red side, but I think you should be looking at the green side.
And I hate you for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly, right on the money. And that's where 70% of the world's spotlight.
That's exciting.
I know, hide the balls is what I say.
But one of the other ways that we're influencing people is by programs like Star Trek.
Yeah.
Which are dealing with precisely that. And they've taken it to another analogy where we can look at it and not feel threatened.
Don't you think that was healthy?
Yeah.
That was classic third-person world-centered. We're meeting the other, which is the big obsession of postmodernism, but actually trying to take the role of the other, understand it. So on. I think people related to Captain Kirk because he had a world-centric consciousness. I think that was people sort of.
I go for Picard instead.
What's that?
I go for Picard.
Oh, Picard. Well, yeah, and you know what I keep thinking when I see him?
More like you.
Yeah. That's what I think, though. It's like, that far into the future, and they still haven't found a cure for baldness. What is the story there? I mean, I'm not sure I want that. And how that's going to be?
They still like their testosterone.
Right, they haven't blocked the testosterone, have they? That's what causes baldness.
I think there's going to be alopecia for everybody.
That's
but then you don't deal with this stuff. There's a wonderful little story. Reb Schmelke of Nikolsburg is walking down the street. He lived in Bohemia at that time, and by that time the modern young people would come up with the horn-rimmed glasses over the pince nez and with a walking stick and shaven. He walks by them and he says, "Oi, you'll never repent." And they say, "Herr Rabbiner, why do you say we'll never repent?" He says, "Look, you get older, you see the beard is getting white, You can't see so well, you need glasses. You can't walk straight without a cane. You recognize you have to repent. You already walk with a cane. You already have glasses. You don't have a beard. You'll never repent." I think that it may be just in the future that all that stuff that goes with hair might go away.
Yeah, well, we very well. There's a good chance that if you're, that y'all will live 100,000 years. I mean, this is a realistic possibility.
Well, we really better have it together to keep growing, or we'll be so bored.
That's the point, isn't it? It's actually wrote a science fiction novel where people live that long, and the only thing they would do, they had to turn within because they've tasted everything on the outside. Well, the first 50,000 years of your life, you've done everything. You've slept with everybody, done every drug, and then you just have to turn within, So it's something to think about.
Well, there's something that Jean Houston talks about. She says there is a level at which the vibratory level jumps off the wire. So that which is sound vibration, when it gets to 40,000 or something, becomes radio waves. And there is a point in which human, so and so many brain cells, and it becomes human mind.
Yeah.
So and so many people on the planet, and we'll have to become telepathic. And and I have that sense that
I wouldn't rule that out. Yeah, that seems possible in a certain sense. Sure.
It looks that the density of population is going to bring us to that thing.
Yeah.
Once we're telepathic, then the rest of it goes with the flow share that happens in the body.
Yeah.
If my toe needs more blood or more nutrition, then the body doesn't ask it in triplicate,
that's what we all want, is to be telepathic and to have 70% of the thoughts invading us be ethnocentric stuff. I'm looking forward to that. I don't know. That'll keep me up.
One of the thinkers that I've studied the most in depth is Søren Kierkegaard. And the way he talks about the critical juncture, can you make this transition?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, as we're approaching the place to move beyond postmodern into integral and transpersonal consciousness, is the same sort of barrier there, and does it require a Kierkegaardian sort of encounter? Yeah. And if so, the other two ingredients that I want to plug into this, Spinoza and Gaia consciousness.
Yeah.
I've been sort of encountering the living earth in that sort of Kierkegaardian way of,
Right.
Do I believe the earth is alive?
Right. Right.
The question is, like Kierkegaard very clearly says, no other person can help you to do that.
Yeah.
That's something that needs to be done in solitude. So I'm wondering, when we're dealing with something like the living earth, in which the encounter is encountering you no longer as other to me,
Yeah. Right.
and this sort of inclusive I,
Right.
the border between what is self and what is other gets very mixed up.
Yes.
And I'm wondering about the sort of Socratic separation that necessarily comes between people,
Right.
and what can we do to assist? Is this revelation of the living earth different,
Yeah.
essentially, than Kierkegaard's premise,
Yeah.
or is it not?
Yeah. Well, keep in mind that Kierkegaard himself had 3 or 4 stages of development,
Yeah.
as you know, and the 3 roughly are pre-rational, rational, and trans-rational. For him, they were sensory, ethical, and then this spiritual. And his really important point is that it can't be answered with sensory awareness or ethical awareness. That's very, very important. Because Gaia can't be known sensory either. In other words, most people take Gaia as just what is nature that I see out there. For Kierkegaard, that's stage 1. That's the lowest understanding you can have. And so it's my interpretation of that transrational leap is that it really is the discovery of interiority, the subjectivity of all existence. And that's why for Kierkegaard it was existential meaning, positive existence, sort of an I amness experience of the entire domain of existence. And the criticism that I would have is it's just with those kind of 3-stage schemes, even though I think it was brilliant for what it did, and particularly counteracting a certain abstractness of the Hegelian system that he was reacting to, and drawing on the positive parts of Schelling, which I think is the best, because Schelling, I think, was just a genius of all of the idealists. I think he was where it was really happening. So I think Kierkegaard is brilliant in that way, but we have a little bit more sophisticated developmental schemes, and it doesn't work quite that abruptly, it doesn't look like. And you can have very sharp peak experiences, which I believe he had, Satori-like experiences. But then you have to track where the center of gravity is as it starts notching up these stages. And one of the things we find is that there's stages of development and states of consciousness. Stages and states of consciousness. What happens when you experience an altered state is that it moves you through the stages faster. And so even with Kierkegaard's 3 stages, when he has a Satori experience, it's moving his center of gravity up that sequence. And so I think a full-blown experience of Gaia consciousness as not exterior, sensory, or ethical, but as this transrational, transpersonal, superconscious state. I think that's a very real experience. I don't know that he would interpret his experience quite that way, because the culture's a little bit different. People now are more likely to experience it as Gaia consciousness, because that's the terms that they've learned for it. But I think the experience is essentially similar. I think it's in that trans-rational, transpersonal, if it's authentic. And then using a little bit more sophisticated developmental scales, though we can plot it a little bit better. You know, Kierkegaard's a pioneer at this sort of existential realization, and that's why he's so genius about it. And in particular, counteracting the notion that just knowing it as a third-person philosophical system doesn't do it. It has to be a first-person realization. That's his genius.
But my question again is the role of the second person in the transition between the first and third.
And is it? Because it's solitary. Because referring to that part of the
right. Yeah, and also. As we move to whole planetary consciousness, I come to the understanding that in my standing before the divine, or as he would say it, or releasing my I-ness, that I'm not alone in that,
right.
And that he stressed the solitude of that experience,
right.
And so I'm wondering,
right.
in creating the Sangha, in this
right.
communal experience,
right.
Is Gaia a different model, so much so that the solitariness is counteractive to it?
Okay, here's
and sort of the difference between communal religious experience and solitary, and how is that?
See, this is where I think using something like an integral approach, integral operating system, is helpful, because the general template itself suggests that these 4 quadrants go all the way up and down. So even at a trans-rational level, even though we're talking about sort of first person, second person, third person, as a matter of fact, even at first person, there's I, we, and it. Those are still there. They can't be self-reflexively grasped. But there's still an inside and an outside and others and all that. So the 4 quadrants at egocentric, there's 4 quadrants at ethnocentric, at world-centric, and at cosmocentric, or trans-rational. And sometimes people tap into one of the quadrants and experience it more than the others. So some people experience it as a group joining. Some people experience it more in a solitary moment. But I think if you put all these experiences together, it really suggests that even in the spiritual domain, there's an I, a we, and an it. There's a solitariness about Atman. There's a pure aloneness. And what do you call it? Apply the alone to the alone. That aloneness is a very real experience, a very real component of it. But that aloneness is reverberating in all other sentient beings. And you can actually, that's the Gaia side of the experience, is an intersubjective resonance with all sentient beings that are arising, and you can feel it that way. There's also there's an otherness about it too, an itness, and I think all of those arise within this higher space of transpersonal awareness.
Could you say then that as part of the evolution of the planetary consciousness, that certain spheres, being that upper left, I think you said, so have evolved faster, just like you said about cognitive going faster. So
in some ways they do.
So that alone space tapped into the higher level of consciousness of cosmocentric
it
first,
always happens that way.
And that other quadrants need to be raised up to
That's
that
usually
level.
what happens. There's an interior I-ness that pushes forward, because that's where intentionality is. And it's not just in the higher states. When somebody first experienced magic out of our cake, it was some lonely somebody that did it and managed somehow to communicate it with others. And I think that happens all the way up the scale. And so it's very, very common to get into the pure I experience, but then when you look at it very closely, it resonates with people at that depth, and then you get Buddha, Dharma, Sangha regenerating at any of these levels.
Yeshika, let me read you a psalm, then I give you the book, and then I'll walk you out.
Okay.
Yah, our master, this is Psalm 8. How mighty is your fame all over earth. Such glory you radiate from the heavens. Your strength is founded in babes and toddlers' first speech. It can overcome all your vengeful foes. I'm awed when I see your skies, your handiwork and fingerprints, the moon and stars you have arranged. What are we who must die that you would be mindful of us? What is a human being that you should take notice? Yet we are only a touch less than divine. You crowned us with glorious splendor. You set us to manage all that you designed. All of it you have made our responsibility. Flocks, birds, all of them, as well as the animals of the wild, birds of the sky, fish of the sea, who traject the oceans. Yah, our master, how splendid is your name in all the world.
Great.
Bless you.
Well, this is what a great birthday.
It was a wonderful learning session. Hey, bless you.
Well, bless you, and thanks for having us here on this special day. This is great.
It all worked out.
It did work out.
With calendar and this and that. Yeah, Providence is still at work.
Y'all think about it now. We just, and I want to hear what y'all are up to. I want to eat, and y'all talk.